Dr. Alice McKenzie, professor at the Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University, tells a wonderful story about her friend Gary. Gary was in his 40s, married and divorced 3 times, and dating a woman who was also divorced and the mother of a 7-year-old daughter, when he and his fiancée asked her if she would marry them. About a month into their counseling and the planning for the wedding, Gary, it seems, began to have a serious case of cold feet. When he shared this with his fiancée, she suggested that perhaps he should take a day to get away and clear his head. So one day he did, and he started driving with no clear destination in mind and ended up at Lake Texoma. Once there, he got out of his car and began to walk around in an attempt to soothe his jangled nerves. Spotting a bench near the lakeshore, he sat down and began breathing deeply in and out as he tried to unravel the knots in his stomach. As he sat there staring out at the lake, it was as if he were looking into a mirror of his soul. And things began to become more clear. He saw that there were 3 knots in his stomach, and that each one had a name. One was his fear that the odds were against him. 2, that he would just keep repeating the same relationship pattern over and over again. Actually, that was the first one. The second was his fear of all the outside stresses coming at the fragile new family they were forming. Stress of a custody battle, job stress, pressures from their extended family. And the third knot was the hardest of all. It was the fear that he was just not worthy of another human being's love. In fact, that he was not worthy of God's love either. He had the right idea, McKenzie says, taking time to find a quiet place to sit and name those knots in his stomach, because each of us needs to name our own knots and to focus our own fears. In this morning's gospel lesson, we find the disciples in a boat in the midst of a powerful storm that had arisen quickly on the Sea of Galilee, as storms there often do. As Matthew tells us, they were far from land, and the wind was against them. And Jesus was back on the shore, enjoying a little time away from the crowds, a little quiet time with God. And Matthew tells us they were afraid, very afraid. Then in the early hours of the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea, and they were even more afraid. Terrified, they cried out to him, saying, "It's a ghost." But immediately, in the midst of their fear, Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter, God love him, Peter responds first, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus did as he asked, and Peter got out of the boat and began walking on the water towards Jesus. Then, as the story continues, when Peter noticed those still strong winds, he once again became frightened, like Colin pointed out, and began to sink, crying out, "Lord, save me!" And Jesus, probably with a chuckle, immediately reached out his hand and caught him. There's so much about this story that I love. First and foremost is my affinity with Peter. I can identify with Peter. Like Peter, I often want to be brave. And as you know, I can be more than a little impulsive at times. No laughing. But perhaps the thing I identify with most is the paralyzing fear that comes once Peter realizes that he may have bitten off more than he can chew. Because you see, that's what happens to me. That's what happens when I'm feeling uncertain about the future, or when I realize that I'm not as in control as I'd like to be it something to do with the church, or my personal life, my health, or even the future of our country. More often than not, I find myself engulfed in this overwhelming and yes, paralyzing sense of fear and foreboding. And then I find myself stuck, unable to move forward, unable to do what I need to do because I'm afraid. Did I mention that I'm a world-class worrier? Anyway, when this happens, my tendency is to cocoon, to withdraw into myself and kind of wish it all away. Unfortunately, that's not a realistic solution, especially when you have others depending on you for their care, or when you're the supposed spiritual leader of a church. That's why I think the story of Jesus and Peter can be so instructive to those like me, and perhaps to some of you. So often we've been taught with this story that Peter's problem, his sin, if you will, was a lack of faith and focus. That if only he'd believed enough, if only he'd kept his eyes on Jesus, he would never have begun to sink. And while there may be some truth to those assumptions, I'd like to suggest to you this morning that Peter didn't flounder because he lacked either faith or focus, but rather because of his fear. A fear that is, by the way, justified. After all, he is in the midst of a storm that's powerful enough to sink a small boat. Of course he's afraid. Who of us wouldn't be? As David Lowe says, that fear is debilitating. And I know that to be true. It sneaks up on us, paralyzes us, and yes, makes it difficult to move forward at all, let alone with confidence. In short, Lowe says, fear is one of the primary things that robs the children of God of the abundant life God intends for each of us. And for that reason, he suggests that Jesus' words to the disciples at the end of today's passage might better be read as a lament than as a rebuke, which is very good news to fearful people like me. I mean, think about it. When the disciples are in the midst of the storm, when they're most fearful, what is it that Jesus does? He comes to them. He walks toward them. And when Peter is drowning, paralyzed by his own fear, what does Jesus do? He reaches out and he grabs him. Instead of urging him to be more courageous or instructing him to just keep his eye on him, Jesus grabs hold of Peter and won't let go. He meets him where he is, afraid and floundering, paralyzed and drowning, and he grabs him and he doesn't let go until they are both safely in the boat. For me, that's the gospel good news of this passage, that God is with us in the midst of our storms, that God has a grip on us, that God won't let us go, won't let us drown, that God will not give up on us even when we give up on ourselves. In other words, God's got our back. As I think about this congregation and the greater world of which we are a part, I realize that many of us find ourselves in the midst of one kind of storm or another. And that often we too are afraid. For some of us, we are fearful about things going on in our country, the protests that turn violent, the possibility of nuclear war with that crazy man in North Korea, the hate and mistrust that divides us as a nation. That's a lot to be fearful about. Others are fearful about the future of the United Methodist Church and the viability of this congregation. Can we make it in light of financial challenges and in light of a culture that's more and more finds the church to be irrelevant or an institution that outlived its time or can't be trusted? For others of you, the storms are more personal. Problems with relationships. Struggles with your kids, issues of employment, failing health, grief over the death of someone dear, worry about your own financial stability, fear that you've somehow been judged and found wanting, that you don't quite measure up, fear of being alone. The list could go on. Hear this. Fear is real. And it's important for us to understand that fear does not equate with a lack of faith. And that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to face our fears, to name them, then to do what we need to do even though we are afraid. The message of Matthew's gospel in a whole is one of hope and comfort. The message that God is with us and for us. That God grabs hold of us when we feel like we're drowning and will never let us go. That God will do in and through us the things that we cannot do on our own. God created us to be whole. To be in relationship with God, the one in whom we ultimately find that wholeness. And that belief is the basis of our hope even in the midst of fear. Even in the middle of the storms life invariably brings our way, and it is our trust in God's presence with us that allows us to transcend our fears and become more fully the people God created us to be. Going back to the man in the story, Dr. McKenzie tells us that his story didn't end there on that bench on the shores of Lake Texoma. Fearing that he was beyond forgiveness, beyond a new future, his boat battered by waves, the odds against him. He says that as he sat there meditating, he felt rather than heard the words, "Let them go. You don't need them anymore. Let them go." Then as he opened his eyes and as he gazed out at the calm waters, 3 geese toddled up to him, prodding aggressively at his legs with their beaks. Finally, seeing that he had nothing for them, they made for the lake and one by one took flight out over the water and up into the distance, like squawking blue angels in formation. He said he sat and stared at them until they were specks on the horizon. Then he got up and walked to his car, filled with a sense of peace. Have you ever had those moments in your life? I have. Often in the midst of the greatest storms. But Dr. McKenzie is also quick to acknowledge that our fears don't really fly off like that and never return again. She says they circle back from time to time, honking and flapping their wings, sometimes landing in our souls and nudging around to see if we had food for them this time. A morsel of misery, she says, a crust of criticism, a nugget of negativity. But they don't stay as long if our heart is already occupied by someone else. Someone who never stands on the shore watching us suffer, but is always walking toward us on the sea, stretching out a hand to us with forgiveness, love, grace, mercy. Reaching out a hand to us that is both very human and also the very hand of God. Thanks be to our very real God, who is always reaching out to us, who is present with us in the midst of all our fears, in all of our chaos, in all of our storms, and who is the one true source of our hope, our comfort, our courage, and our strength. Thanks be to God. Amen.